BTS news today. For weeks, the silence surrounding Jungkook and Jimin has felt louder than any stadium chant. In an industry where every breath is tracked, every step photographed, and every smile analyzed frame by frame, the sudden absence of two of the most visible figures in global pop culture has ignited an emotional wildfire. Fans noticed it first not through an official announcement, but through the quiet gaps where their presence was expected. No airport photos, no late-night lives, no casual updates that once felt as natural as breathing. Just absence. And in that absence, questions multiplied faster than answers. At first, many believed it was nothing more than a short break, a strategic pause before another massive reveal. BTS have mastered the art of anticipation over the years, and ARMY is no stranger to waiting. But this time felt different. The calendar moved forward, events passed, and yet Jungkook and Jimin remained unseen. Their names trended daily, not because of something they did, but because of what they didn't. In the world of pop culture, silence is never empty. It is filled with speculation, fear, hope, and longing. What made their disappearance even more unsettling was the contrast to their past openness. Jungkook, once known for his spontaneous lives, his late-night confessions, and his unfiltered laughter, had seemingly gone dark. Jimin, whose presence carried warmth, emotional honesty, and an almost magnetic vulnerability, was suddenly unreachable. Together, they had formed a dynamic that fans felt deeply connected to, not just as artists, but as human beings navigating fame under impossible pressure. Behind the scenes, however, a different story was unfolding, one far more complex than rumors could ever capture. According to those close to the situation, the disappearance was not a single decision, but the result of many moments building quietly over time. Moments of exhaustion hidden behind perfect performances. Moments of emotional weight that no spotlight could illuminate. Moments when even the strongest bonds are tested by expectations that never rest. The global success of their solo projects had brought new heights, but also new burdens. Jungkook's rise as a solo force placed him under an even sharper microscope. Every lyric was dissected as confession. Every absence was treated as a statement. Jimin, too, faced constant interpretation, his artistry often reduced to narratives written by others. The pressure to always be present, always be perfect, slowly began to collide with their need to simply exist as themselves. Sources suggest that the turning point came not during a public scandal or dramatic confrontation, but in quiet, deeply personal conversations. Conversations about identity, about the cost of being constantly visible, and about the fear of losing oneself in the image the world demands. Jungkook reportedly expressed a growing sense of disconnection, not from fans, but from his own reflection. Jimin, ever perceptive, felt the same weight, though he carried it in silence far longer. Their decision to step back was not an escape, but an act of preservation. In an industry that rewards endurance over well-being, choosing to pause can feel almost rebellious. Yet for Jungkook and Jimin, it became necessary. They needed space not to disappear from the world, but to return to themselves, to remember why they began, to feel without performing. This absence was also shaped by their bond with each other. Those who know them well describe long nights of conversation, shared doubts, and unspoken understanding. The kind of bond that doesn't need explanation, only trust. Rather than separating under pressure, they reportedly leaned closer, choosing to face uncertainty together. In a world eager to pit artists against one another, their quiet unity became an unspoken statement. Still, the silence hurt. Fans felt it deeply, interpreting the absence through their own fears. Some worried about health. Others feared internal conflict, company restrictions, or even permanent separation. Social media became a battleground of theories, each louder than the last. And yet, amid the noise, there were also voices of patience. Fans who remembered that behind the names were human beings who had given more than a decade of their lives to the world. Industry insiders hint that the disappearance was carefully coordinated, not to deceive, but to protect. Schedules were adjusted. Appearances quietly canceled. Statements deliberately withheld. In an age of instant explanations, the choice not to speak was intentional. Jungkook and Jimin did not want their pause to become content. They did not want their healing to be branded, monetized, or reduced to headlines. They wanted it to be real. What makes this story so powerful is not the mystery itself, but what it reveals about the cost of global stardom. Jungkook and Jimin are not the first artists to step back, but their disappearance feels heavier because of how deeply fans feel connected to them. They are not distant idols. They are voices that grew up alongside millions. Their absence feels personal because their presence always was. There are whispers now of their return, subtle signs that the silence may soon break. A registered song title here, a quiet studio sighting there. Nothing confirmed, yet everything meaningful. Those close to them say that when they return, it will not be the same. Not in the sense of loss, but in growth. They will return with clearer boundaries, deeper self-awareness, and a stronger understanding of what they can give without losing themselves. The true story behind their public disappearance is not one of scandal or collapse. It is a story of choosing humanity over expectation. of two artists who reached the highest peaks and realized that survival at the top requires more than talent. It requires rest. It requires honesty. It requires the courage to step away even when the world begs you to stay. For now, Jungkook and Jimin remain mostly unseen, but not gone. Their silence is not emptiness, but a breath being taken before the next chapter. And when that chapter begins, it will carry the weight of everything they protected by choosing to disappear, if only for a while. Until then, the world waits. Not with demands, but with hope. Because sometimes, the most powerful statement an artist can make is knowing when to step out of the spotlight, so that when they return, they can truly shine again. The waiting, however, has changed the way the world looks at Jungkook and Jimin. What once felt like constant accessibility has been replaced by a deeper awareness of absence, and in that space, something unexpected has happened. Fans have begun to listen more closely, not to new content, but to old moments. Past interviews resurface. Old lyrics feel heavier. Casual jokes from years ago suddenly sound like quiet warnings that no one noticed at the time. In retrospect, the signs were always there, hidden in plain sight. Jungkook's laughter that lingered a second too long, as if masking fatigue. Jimin's emotional honesty that often bordered on apology, as if he felt guilty for not always being okay. These were never red flags in the traditional sense, but they were human moments in an industry that rarely allows humanity to exist without a filter. Their disappearance forced people to look back and realize how much they had been carrying. Inside the company walls, the atmosphere reportedly shifted as well. Executives accustomed to constant output were confronted with something they could not easily manage: artists who knew their limits. Jungkook and Jimin were no longer teenagers chasing a dream. They were global figures who understood their value, not just as performers, but as people. Negotiations became quieter, more careful. Decisions were weighed not only in profit, but in longevity. What many don't realize is that stepping back did not mean stopping completely. Behind closed doors, creativity continued in a different form. Jungkook spent long hours in studios with no cameras, experimenting without pressure, recording and deleting, searching not for a hit, but for truth. Jimin returned to the fundamentals of movement and voice, revisiting what expression meant when no one was watching. This was not preparation for a comeback in the traditional sense. It was a process of reconnection. Their bond during this period reportedly deepened in ways that surprised even those closest to them. Without schedules dictating every hour, they shared ordinary moments that had once been rare. Late meals, silent car rides, conversations that didn't need to lead anywhere. In those moments, the noise of the world faded, and what remained was the simple reality of two people who had grown up together under extraordinary circumstances. This closeness became a quiet anchor. When doubts surfaced, they were shared. When exhaustion returned, it was acknowledged instead of hidden. There was no need to perform strength for each other. That alone, according to insiders, became one of the most healing aspects of their disappearance. It wasn't about isolation from the world, but connection within it. Meanwhile, the public narrative continued to spiral. Some headlines framed the absence as danger. Others romanticized it as a dramatic mystery. Few came close to the truth. The reality was far less sensational and far more profound. Jungkook and Jimin were learning how to exist without constantly explaining themselves. In an era where silence is treated as guilt or weakness, they chose it as a form of self-respect. As weeks turned into months, something shifted within the fandom as well. The panic softened. Conversations became more reflective. Fans began to speak not only about missing them, but about wanting them to be okay. The relationship evolved from consumption to care. It was an unspoken agreement that love does not always demand presence. Sometimes it requires patience. Those close to Jungkook and Jimin say this change did not go unnoticed. They felt it. The pressure that once came from fear of disappointing fans was replaced by something warmer, something steadier. Support without conditions. Trust without deadlines. It became clear that their disappearance had reshaped not just their own boundaries, but the emotional contract between artist and audience. There are moments, still, when the silence feels heavy. Nights when fans wonder if they should have said something more or worried less. But within that uncertainty lies a deeper understanding. Jungkook and Jimin did not vanish to be forgotten. They stepped back so they could return without losing themselves again. When that return happens, it may not be loud. It may not arrive with dramatic teasers or explosive announcements. It may begin with something small, a voice on a track, a message written in simple words, a stage appearance that feels quieter, but infinitely more grounded. And when fans see them again, they may notice something different in their eyes. Not distance, but clarity. The true story behind their public disappearance is still unfolding, not as a scandal to be exposed, but as a lesson being lived. A lesson about limits in a limitless industry. About choosing sustainability over spectacle. About the courage it takes to pause when the world only knows how to push forward. Jungkook and Jimin did not leave because they were weak. They stepped away because they were strong enough to admit they needed to. And in doing so, they may have quietly changed the rules for everyone who comes after them. The silence will not last forever. But when it ends, it will carry meaning far beyond curiosity. It will stand as proof that even at the height of fame, choosing yourself is not abandonment. It is survival. And yet, even as the narrative of healing and quiet strength began to take shape, another layer of the story emerged, one that revealed just how deeply Jungkook and Jimin's disappearance had unsettled the industry itself. Their absence created a vacuum no algorithm could fill. No replacement content could replicate their presence. Charts continued to move, releases continued to come, but something intangible was missing, and everyone could feel it. Producers, collaborators, and creatives who had worked closely with them spoke privately of a shift. Meetings felt different without their energy. Ideas that once sparked instantly now required more effort. Jungkook and Jimin were not just performers who showed up to deliver lines and choreography. They were emotional centers, artists who shaped the atmosphere of any room they entered. Their disappearance exposed how rare that kind of presence truly was. There was also a growing realization that their silence had disrupted the usual power dynamics. In the past, absence was often interpreted as vulnerability. This time, it felt like control. Jungkook and Jimin were no longer reacting to schedules. The schedules were reacting to them. By choosing not to appear, they forced the industry to slow down, to wait, to respect a boundary that could not be negotiated away. Behind closed doors, conversations reportedly took on a more cautious tone. There was an understanding that when Jungkook and Jimin returned, it would be on different terms. Not confrontational, not dramatic, but firm. They had crossed a threshold where compliance was no longer automatic. Their disappearance was not a rebellion shouted from rooftops, but a quiet recalibration of power. For Jungkook, this period became one of the most introspective chapters of his life. Removed from the constant validation of applause and numbers, he began confronting questions he had postponed for years. Who was he when he wasn't being watched? What did his voice sound like without expectation attached to it? Friends say he revisited music not as a product, but as a refuge, returning to melodies that felt raw, imperfect, and deeply personal. Jimin, on the other hand, leaned into stillness. Known for his emotional sensitivity, he had long absorbed the weight of others' feelings alongside his own. This time, he allowed himself to sit with silence instead of filling it. He explored movement not for performance, but for release. Dance became less about precision and more about breathing. Less about being seen and more about feeling. Their parallel journeys did not always require words. Sometimes they existed side by side in quiet understanding, each processing differently, yet connected by shared history. That history, built over years of triumph and exhaustion, became their strongest foundation. They didn't need to explain their fears to each other. They had lived them together. As time passed, subtle signs began to surface, almost imperceptible to casual observers, but deeply meaningful to those paying attention. A familiar producer followed a familiar account again. A lyric draft rumored to exist carried themes of distance and return. Nothing confirmed, nothing denied. Just enough to remind the world that absence does not mean erasure. Fans, too, changed in the way they spoke about them. The tone shifted from urgency to reverence. Instead of demanding updates, many began sharing messages of gratitude, revisiting moments when Jungkook and Jimin had helped them through their own difficult times. It became clear that this disappearance had sparked a collective reflection. People were not just missing idols. They were recognizing the humanity they had always sensed beneath the surface. What makes this chapter so significant is that it refuses to fit into the usual arc of celebrity narratives. There is no villain to blame, no scandal to resolve, no dramatic fall to recover from. There is only growth, quiet and unglamorous, happening away from the spotlight. And perhaps that is why it feels so unsettling to some. It cannot be simplified or sensationalized without losing its truth. The question now is no longer, where are they? But who will they be when they return? Those close to Jungkook and Jimin suggest the answer will surprise people, not because they have changed into someone unrecognizable, but because they have become more themselves than ever before. Less guarded, less apologetic, more intentional. Their disappearance has already left a mark. It has challenged the assumption that artists owe constant visibility. It has reminded the world that even those who seem strongest can choose rest without explanation. And it has shown that sometimes, stepping back is not the end of a story, but the moment it finally begins to tell the truth. When Jungkook and Jimin eventually reappear, it will not erase the silence that came before. That silence will remain part of their narrative, a chapter written not in headlines, but in survival. And for those who have waited, not impatiently but faithfully, that chapter may become the most meaningful one of all. As the months stretched on, the absence of Jungkook and Jimin began to feel less like a gap and more like a presence of its own. Silence, once unsettling, became familiar. It settled into the rhythm of the fandom, into the industry, into the quiet spaces where anticipation no longer screamed but waited. And in that waiting, a deeper truth slowly revealed itself. Their disappearance was not only changing them, it was changing everyone around them. Inside creative circles, there was a growing acknowledgement that something irreversible had happened. Jungkook and Jimin had crossed into a different phase of artistry, one that could not be undone by a simple comeback schedule. The version of them that the world had known, always available, endlessly adaptable, constantly giving, was no longer sustainable. This realization forced collaborators to reconsider how they approached not just these two artists, but the idea of longevity itself. There were reports of projects quietly put on hold, not canceled, but waiting. Waiting not for contracts or approvals, but for readiness. People understood now that when Jungkook and Jimin chose to speak again through their work, it would not be rushed. It would not be shaped by trends or urgency. It would arrive when it was honest. That understanding alone marked a shift rarely seen in an industry driven by immediacy. For Jungkook, the time away from public life revealed contradictions he had long ignored. He loved performing, yet felt drained by constant exposure. He cherished fans, yet struggled with the expectation to always be accessible. In private, he began to reconcile these opposing truths, realizing that love does not disappear when boundaries are drawn. If anything, it deepens. Music became his language again, not to impress, but to process. Songs were written with no intention of release. Just as conversations with himself, Jimin's journey unfolded more quietly, but no less intensely. Known for his emotional intelligence, he had always felt deeply, sometimes too deeply, absorbing not only his own struggles, but the pain of others. This time, he allowed himself to feel without translating those emotions for anyone else. He learned to sit with discomfort, to let questions remain unanswered. Friends say there was a noticeable calm in him, a steadiness that came not from certainty, but from acceptance. Their connection during this period remained constant, though not always dramatic. It wasn't defined by grand gestures or emotional declarations. Instead, it existed in shared understanding, in the comfort of not having to explain. There were days when they spoke little, days when they spoke for hours. Both were equally meaningful. After years of living under the same spotlight, they finally experienced companionship without performance. Outside, the world continued to speculate. Some insisted that the silence was strategic, a build-up to something monumental. Others feared it signaled a permanent withdrawal from public life. But those closest to the truth understood that neither extreme was accurate. This was not an ending, nor a tease. It was a necessary in-between, a liminal space where identities were being redefined. The most profound change, however, appeared within the fandom itself. Without new content to consume, fans began creating something else, reflection. They revisited old performances not for nostalgia, but for understanding. Lyrics once taken at face value now felt confessional. Moments of vulnerability, once fleeting, gained weight. The absence gave those memories room to breathe, to be seen clearly for the first time. There was also a growing sense of protectiveness. Not possessive, but respectful. Fans began calling out harmful speculation, reminding each other that curiosity does not justify intrusion. It was an evolution born directly from Jungkook and Jimin's choice to step back. By modeling boundaries, they taught millions how to honor them. In rare, almost imperceptible ways, they acknowledged this support, not through statements or appearances, but through energy that could be felt rather than seen. A familiar warmth that hadn't vanished, only retreated momentarily. Those who truly listened could sense that the connection was still there, just quieter, more grounded. As whispers of their return grew slightly louder, one thing became increasingly clear. When Jungkook and Jimin come back into public view, the world may expect answers. But answers are not what this story is about. It is about transformation. About what happens when artists choose to survive rather than simply endure. About what is gained when silence is embraced instead of feared. Their disappearance was never meant to be solved like a mystery. It was meant to be understood like a journey. One without a map, without guarantees, guided only by instinct and trust. And perhaps that is why it resonates so deeply. Because at its core, it reflects a universal truth. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is step away, listen to yourself, and return only when you are ready to be real again. The world still waits, but differently now. Not impatiently, not desperately. It waits with respect. And when Jungkook and Jimin finally step back into the light, they will not be returning to the same place they left. They will be arriving somewhere new, carrying with them the quiet strength forged in absence, and the understanding that their worth was never measured by how often they appeared, but by how honestly they chose to exist.